The Necron exist as one of the most terrifying forces in the galaxy of M41. They have, by all estimations, existed longer than any other civilization, and are potentially, if fully awakened, one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy, something only the Eldari seem to understand, having seen this evidenced for themselves, and who would be, in theory, capable of destroying even the Imperium. The Necron have a fascinating history as well, and one that I want to rake over fairly soon. But as often happens while putting together a different video this week, one section of it suddenly spiraled out of my control to a point where I realised it would stand better on its own. Which brings me to the discussion of what do I hate about Necron lore, or to give it a far less sensational title, The Curse of the Necron. Endgame or long-term motivation is something I think we all could easily understand as being an important factor for any faction, because this will often dictate how a faction structures itself and drives its energy towards various core objectives. More than this though, an endgame motivation can fundamentally underlie everything a faction hopes to achieve, everything it does, which brings me to one of my major gripes with the Necron. Now, to be clear, this is a very nitpicky complaint, but what did you expect, honestly? If you have a better gripe than this that you'd like me to dissect, please do put it in the comments. If there's a really interesting or funny one, maybe I'll cover it. Could be an interesting new series. And just before people start engaging their outrage mouth foaming protocols, let me say this. I enjoy the Necron greatly. They're one of the best 40k factions in my opinion. Their history is an immensely great story, their technology in general is terrifying, unique, just as it is awe-inspiring, and some of their technology, like the Celestial Orrery, is absolutely insane. On top of this, they just look awesome. While I have covered the Necron in one of my first videos for 40k, that was, if you can believe it, 8 years ago, this really did not cover things in enough detail or quality. The scale, the grandeur of the Necron civilization, not particularly illustrated at that time. So rest assured, this is on my to-do list. Plus, if you haven't read or listened to the Necron novels, The Infinite and the Divine, The Twice Dead King, Ruin and Reign, you're severely missing out. The story arc for the last two is fantastic, plus amazing character development and a genuinely compelling feel to the way they interact and are motivated. It really helps you to understand the Necron a lot more. Also, because we just get so few specific perspectives of the Xenos factions, these are worthwhile. And when it comes to that matter, these are some of the best. Not least because it completely flips the viewpoint for us of the Imperium. This is something I've tried to underscore often in videos, that 40k is more of a setting that enables stories and narratives to take place more than it is a narrative focused upon the Imperium. It just happens that most of the time the narrative does take place from the perspective of the Imperium. This is why very often in videos I will phrase things from an either for or against the Imperium perspective, and of course the Emperor as well, which comically seems to really confuse some people, and often then I get accused of hating the Imperium and the Emperor, being biased to Xenos, or vice versa, quite honestly. In actuality, I've always tried to ensure that I can present both sides, enjoy all aspects of 40k, because this is how the galaxy of M41 exists, and I enjoy looking at the factions and their various agendas from all sides, because quite honestly, if you aren't doing that, you're missing out on a lot of interesting thought exercises, speculation, discussions, and narrative exploration. So the Necron are both terrifying and comical in equal measure, which is one thing that makes them very compelling. You can't have a galaxy as bleak, dystopian, grim and horrific as that of M41 without also having some dark humour thrown in, and the Necrons excel with this. In the millions of years they slumbered, despite their outlook that they could somehow escape untouched by the forces of entropy, this turned out of course to be inaccurate. And so few Necron would eventually escape the ravages of time. Corrupted code has slowly penetrated the minds of Necron lords and their servant constructs. Many of the lesser Necron forms would simply fail to reactivate. A significant number of their leadership were also damaged by various degrees of madness or disruption to their personality engrams, making them emerge from their slumber deranged or at best far from being the individuals who they entered the tomb as. This concept is one of the things I've always enjoyed about the Necron, that they hold such immense power, they see things on such a grand scale. but even they cannot fully escape the ravages of entropy, and are now emerging with a drive to restore themselves and their power, but this is of course not their ultimate goal for the civilization. Also, lastly, I'll just crowbar in here that I also have my own pretty amazing Necron force, masterfully painted by Siege Studios, and some of them myself, so no one can say I'm not on the Necron team here. What grinds on me is the vague impracticality of their endgame goals, and I'll explain that some more later on. For humanity, their ultimate goals are admittedly a little open-ended, but amount to basically, we must survive so that our culture persists. Then there are many threads as to what this ends up looking like. Does it involve the Emperor or not? Is there some strange division which rips apart the Imperium? It's too big of a picture to really underline beyond kill anything that isn't human, survive until the Emperor can tell us what the hell we're meant to be doing again, which overall I think is fairly fine, although it's not that neat, but at least it's somewhat clear. This is true also for most mortal races, essentially survive, expand, build your culture. For the Mechanicus, as we recently discussed, they have set themselves the goal of acquiring all knowledge and then preserving it, plus something the machine god. It's pretty vague, but they seem quite motivated about it, and undoubtedly it will become clearer over time, so fine, I guess. But actually, I'm not a huge fan of the Mechanicus endgame as well, because it's just not especially clear. There's no sort of rapture event for them or Armageddon once they've finally secured all knowledge. So once you've secured all knowledge in the galaxy, then what? For the Eldar, it's pretty open-ended and similar, but it also involves destroying nemesis enemies and somewhat righting past wrongs to restore themselves to dominance. Within that, of course, you also have specific factions like the Inari, who are on a mad crusade to murder Slaanesh. Ballsy choice, but at least they know what they're doing. The Dark Eldar have driven themselves into a dead-end road of suffering, but they're absolutely fine with this for the most part. They just want to avoid chaos and Slaanesh and continue to enjoy their horrifying lives of extreme experience until they somehow reach oblivion. Quite horrific, but again, at least they're owning it. For the Orcs, of course, very nice and simple: fight, smash things, get bigger, smash more things, and generally have a big fight, and a good laugh while you're at it. It's very wholesome and straightforward. The Votan, who knows honestly, I'm guessing brewing some space ale or other fantasy dwarven trope, but in seriousness they're pretty unexciting. It's more of the same: expand territory, survive, and so on. The Tyranids have one of the purest goals: devour, consume biomass, repeat. Basically that's it, sorted. They are, as I say, one of the purest survival forms in the galaxy. They're very unclouded, they don't have any weird internal political issues. So despite their overarching goals being brutally simple, it makes sense, it works for them. Destroy the galaxy, move on. Chaos, as I discussed pretty recently, has a very confusing mixed bag of goals, but you would expect this, wouldn't you, because it's chaos. And when you lay them all out, they can at least be traced back to some kind of genuine motivation that makes sense. Most often that still is power, acquiring more power, fueling their power. It's a complex patchwork quilt of mortal suffering, but again, it makes sense. And even if it didn't, that would actually be alright, because it's chaos after all. And then the Tau, again, pretty straightforward: expand, innovate, survive, with the goal of preserving and furthering their culture, a pretty baseline motivation for a mortal race, but again, in context, it's all good. And then there's the Necrons. The Necrons are more complicated. After waking up from an especially long, particularly heavy slumber, they're discovering that the pesky mortal races have spawned disgustingly all over their pristine dead worlds, and worse, far from struggling, they're everywhere. So understandably, they're not in the best of moods. The Necrons' goal is to retake their position as the supreme overlords of the galaxy. Destroying Chaos and the Eldar goes without saying, as they are the nemesis enemies, and their original plan of allowing passive attrition to take care of everything didn't really pan out. So now they're just getting to work with their supposed core goals being to reconquer the territory within the galaxy and restore order, glory to their dynasties. Now we'll circle back shortly, but first, a very brief but necessary history about the Necron. The Necron arrived in Warhammer 40,000 in the 3rd edition. This was back in the halcyon days of 2002. Their lore would of course later become one of the biggest, let's say, corrections in 40k lore. In this time though, the Necron lore essentially had the end of the war in heaven culminate with the unleashing of warp horrors, notably enslavers, and that the Necrons remained also enslaved and subservient to the C'tan, all of whom would enter a period of extended sleep using the Necron's stasis technology. The Necron and C'tan, that is, not the enslavers. The unstable warp power and the horrors pouring out of it at this time were anathema to the C'tan, just as the Eldar were. And they could see that the warp horrors were going to scour the galaxy of all significant amounts of mortal life, which they were feeding upon. For the C'tan though, and now the basically immortal Necron, they had no mortal perceptions of time and so decided that it was best all around to just sleep for a few million years, and then awaken to a new galaxy where the warp had calmed once again and would be full of life for them to feast upon. It seemed like a solid plan. Also, in this early lore, the Silent King was not a major part of the Necron tier fate, because it was the C'tan who remained the ultimate masters, notably the C'tan known as the Deceiver, who had tricked the Necron into the process of biotransference, thereby becoming eternal slaves for the C'tan, fulfilling the long-standing dream also of the Necron tier to achieve immortality, and for the C'tan aid them in destroying the Old Ones and any of their spawned allies that could potentially threaten them. The only part of the deal that was omitted was any mention about how the Necron were going to be enslaved to the will of the C'tan forever. Also within this ancient lore was that of the pariahs. Most people know of pariahs as being those humans who are basically anti-psyker. They are so opposite on the scale of psychic power that they can be used as a weapon against psykers. They effectively nullify their power, like the Sisters of Silence, even causing them pain just by being in their passive presence, and even that of ordinary humans for that matter. In the first Necron appearance though, human pariahs were being captured by the Necron, forged into these bizarre warrior forms, also known as pariahs. It was even suggested that the C'tan or Necron had seeded ancient humanity with a pariah gene to, over millennia, produce the harvest they were now of pariahs. Of course, this lore would disappear, never to be mentioned again. Now, although a little straightforward, the original lore of the Necron made sense. Some of the C'tan had not remained in sleep as long or even at all as the others, such as the Nightbringer and the Deceiver, and the Necron continue serving them as their physical army, to aid the C'tan in scouring the worlds of mortal forms that they seek to feast upon. Interestingly enough as well, as is so often the case with 40k lore, a lot of this very old stuff somehow remains relevant or inspirational for the current time, because it appears some of the most contemporary events were revealed in this very early lore, much like the arrival of the Inari and Aeneid. The Pariah Nexus appears to have been revealed in the first Necron lore, where in the words of an Eldar Farseer who describes how they populate the geometric schism of changeless real space that the C'tan have worked long millennia to construct. A psychic void, the warp cannot exist there, the spirit cannot exist there. They're basically talking about the Pariah Nexus. So it's like, fine, at least this all makes sense, but it is admittedly a little dry. There's very little room for interesting cultural development, as the Necrons are basically unable to determine their own destiny. So this old lore does kind of trap them in the role of C'tan's soldiers, with very little room to go anywhere else from there. Fast forward to 2011 and the 5th edition of Warhammer 40,000. The Necrons get a new codex and the revelation of a new background. Clearly the Imperial scholars who found those ancient texts from the 3rd were misdirected. Scam Xenos artifact resellers, a bizarre Inquisition faction, who can say? But what we knew was, this was now the story of the Necron tier, not those lies from before. So now, the Necron did not remain as they were before, being subservient to the C'tan, that they might reawaken at the behest of the Star Gods to be their slave warriors and scour mortal worlds to fuel the ever-thirsty C'tan with their soul energy, leading lives of eternal service as undead living metal warriors. Things were dramatically different now. Instead of remaining enslaved to the C'tan at the end of the War in Heaven, now it was told to us that the Necron had rebelled and turned their immense technological power upon the depleted and off-guard C'tan. Such beings could not be destroyed though, for they were made of the very essence of the universe, and so the best that could be accomplished was in shattering and imprisoning these shards of C'tan, thus effectively destroying them. The shards of the C'tan were imprisoned in the Necron's extremely advanced technology, each shard being placed in their Tesseract labyrinths. The shard of the C'tan could, in theory, provide them with all the power they would need for all time. Then there also would emerge the Silent King, who takes on the burden of being now largely responsible for the entire biotransference process of the Necrons, and who would carry this weight of their ultimate fate alone. He leaves being very unhappy at seeing how he has doomed his race to an eternity of basically cultural stagnation, a dead end. Most Necron tier, other than those of the senior ranking aristocracy, have their identities and minds reduced to data mush. Carrying the extreme guilt of this, Zarek leaves to wander in the wilderness of the Void for a time. Middle, the Silent King returns. The Necron have something of a new focus and direction, and then we begin this time where Blackstone is becoming important, the Great Rift, the Pariah Nexus, and so on. Also, another thing that got changed, even in the revised lore of the Necron, it was stated that the Necron could only travel through the ancient dolmen gates of the old ones. They used the webway for travelling faster than light, but this significantly limited the travel ability of the Necron. It was specifically stated that they cannot use the warp for travel as they have no psychers, and that without the dolmen gates and the webway, they would be very restricted to sublight travel and isolation. In some ways, this technicality added some very interesting restrictions on the expansion of the Necron, because it meant that they could only travel to systems where they could use the webway and dolmen gates for. In theory, this would have considerably restricted their travel around the galaxy, meaning it was unlikely that they would threaten significant portions of the Imperium. It would also probably prevent the Necron threat from spiraling out of control like the Tyranids and just having them go wherever they wanted to. But that always also grated on me a little, because does it make sense that a civilization with the power to destroy literal star gods and a machine that allows you to just snuff out a star with a touch would have no other means of traversing the entire galaxy? Somebody obviously agreed, because this was yet another detail that would get scrubbed later. In the current Necron lore, it describes how Necron cryptechs enable their technologies such as tomb ships, which have drives capable of traversing interstellar gulfs almost as quickly as warp travel and far safer. Remembering that the Necron are said to have quantum wormhole technology, which they also use for deploying units to a world. They do also retain the use of the dolmen gates of the old ones, but this is now not a restricting factor of the Necron as it was previously thought to be. So really what I'm trying to illustrate here is that a lot of things have changed when it comes to the Necron. So is my gripe with the Necron that they're cursed to endure these constant lore corrections and reframings? That out of all of the civs in 40k, they're the ones who keep getting chopped and changed the most? Surprisingly, no. So what is the problem? Everything seems pretty good so far. Well, my gripe with the Necron is the state of their ultimate endgame, as I was saying. The reason this problem bothers me so is because the Necron are not like other mortal races. They aren't just looking for a short-term survival. They're not looking 100 or even a millennia into the future. They're looking at a far greater timescale. In fact, I would suggest they're barely concerned with short-term survival unless it's literally an impending assault upon a tomb world. So yes, they want to reconquer the territory within the galaxy and restore the glory to their dynasties. This all sounds good, it works, it enables short-term interest for the Necron in the context of the 40k galaxy. Where they're awakening, they are strengthening their forces, we wonder what impact is this going to have on the Imperium and so on. Plus, there's also now the interesting feature of the Pariah Nexus, the Blackstone pylons, and all the stuff that's happening there in relation to the Great Rift. You also do have individuals of note within the Necron Empire, like Illuminor Xeras, Trazyn the Infinite. They're all doing their own thing as well. So there's plenty going on with the Necron in the short term. This is all fine. My gripe is the long-term plans of the Necron. which I refuse to accept is just an irrelevant small thing. It matters to me, okay? Because if the Necron were to be successful, and this is bleeding over a little into another what if they ruled the galaxy vid, but if the Necron were successful in their goals, okay, then what? This really matters, because apparently it remains a goal of the Necron to seek to reverse the process of biotransference for themselves, basically to make themselves flesh and blood, mortal again. This has been stated as the goal of several Necron dynasty. It seems to be a goal for the Silent King, and for those, for example, who hail from Zantragora. The problem with this goal is that even if it could be achieved, would they willingly welcome this in actuality? To once again become flesh and blood, to accept their lives would sometime end. The populace were always seen as just an anonymous peasantry by the ruling nobles of the Necron tier anyway, but after biotransference, so little remains of their soul that the Necron warriors and lower tier servants of the dynasty are very little more than zombies. They're basically just animated instinct. So what would biotransference look like for them? Or is the plan for only those of the more sentient Necron to reverse their immortal forms? And then what, breed a new race? Or do they use some kind of cloning technique? Do some of them stay as immortal Necron? The Silent King, for example, is described as being given the most sophisticated and powerful Necron body during biotransference, that he maintains a sensory and neurological network far superior to anything flesh and blood could create. His physical form is built from the necrodermis of a Khitan. So, is he going to willingly give that up and go back to an extremely fragile mortal form? I'm not so sure. The Necrons are certainly interesting for what they are. They're different dynasties, the curious characters who rule now, having spent millions of years in sleep and existence, undoubtedly leading to some eccentric traits. They're insanely advanced technology that by all rights should be able to obliterate anything that they encounter. All of this, though, in many ways, is quite superficial. What I find is most captivating about most of the races and civs in 40k is their ultimate motivations, and for me personally, because I'm incredibly finicky about such things, also that motivation making sense. What I mean is, the two states of the Necron do not seem to connect or align clearly. The idea of the Necron willingly reversing their lives of immortality seems a little oil and water to me. The Necron Empire has survived since the time of the Old Ones, literally millions of years, but it is also built upon them no longer perceiving time as mortals do. Additionally, as noted, many Necron hold power that is unthinkable and perhaps also uncontrollable, even deadly, if they were in a mortal form themselves. You have to also ask the question, could they maintain or even use their existing technology with the constraint of a mortal shell? Have they so easily forgotten that one of the main reasons they started this entire pathway was to avoid the limitations and miserable suffering of mortal lives? In fairness, to forget such a thing across several million years is entirely possible. Do they seek to reverse this biotransference process because Zarak feels bad about what happened during the original process for his people? Well, okay, except the Necron tier were notorious for not particularly caring about the lower classes. This is why they viewed their mortality so flippantly in the first place. So this is something you see even in the nobles of the ruling Necron dynasty to their subordinates now as well. I suppose you could argue that Zarak saw that he had doomed his civilization to this eternal cul-de-sac in one sense, and he realised that their cultural path forward was dead, not dissimilarly to something like the Overlords in Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, where they have reached the end point of their cultural evolution, and with no way to progress forward, they become basically caretakers for the galaxy, something they are not especially thrilled about. In the 5th Codex, it speaks to the nobles of Zantragora having one goal: to undo biotransference, to transfer Necron consciousness into the bodies of other sentient creatures. To this end, they endlessly are attempting to research and unlock the means by which to do this, which takes the form of horrifying abductions, dragging living beings back to their tomb laboratories, where a never-ending process of autopsy, vivisection, gene splicing, tissue manipulation and molecular deconstruction takes place. This, of course, as I said earlier, would later also be the world upon which Illuminor Xeras conducts his experiments into life. But while Xeras was meant to have been one of the minds behind the original biotransference process, I always thought it was just the Khitan But now apparently Xerath was largely involved with that biotransference process, but also has no idea how to reverse this?
Unshrink you? Well, that would require some sort of a rebigulator, which is a concept so ridiculous it makes me want to laugh out loud.
And then, not to mention, as I've already said, what happens when they reconvert all the peasantry who had their minds crushed? They just end up with a population of brain-dead, empty corpses, effectively? How is that going to help rebuild their population? Do they weave some magic biotech wand and reactivate the spark in the mind? That's not really how I understood it all worked, because I always read the biotransference process as being akin to them having several high-end 10 terabyte SSD for the very important files, and then they had, say, 100,000 old floppy disks, but each could only contain 80 kilobytes. Which of course meant that unfortunately for most of the population, 99.9% of that data going onto those was lost, and you can't just magic it back. So what happens? Do they just leave the Necron servant class as living metal slaves, and then only reanimate the upper tier of Necron? How many people is that going to be? How will they create a functioning reproductive system? How did the Necron tier even reproduce in the past? Will all of the Necron dynasties be on board with this idea? What if some of them don't like the idea of returning to a mortal life that means they will then inevitably die? This was the only thing that they had attempted to solve in the ancient times, and I would guess some of them are just fine with things staying as they are. The only interesting thing it raises for me is the concept of civilization and culture. Is a civilization defined by its mortality, in the sense of, if you were an immortal race such as the Necron, you can't reproduce or really do any of those things that mortal races feel and do. So can you really build what we would consider to be a culture? Art, entertainment, leisure, and so on. And without going off on a huge tangent here about what culture is, it's basically an intrinsic part of any civilization. I would go so far as to say essential. And this is the only reason I can imagine for successfully reversing the state that the Necron find themselves in. This is perhaps something even the Necron have realised, but only in the aftermath of biotransference, seeing what they fundamentally lost, not to mention their inability to truly grow their culture as mortal civilizations do. The Necron cannot really develop in a forward progression. Anyway, I think you get the point. So the fundamental goal for the Necron in reversing their eternal form seems to have given us more questions than answers, and a lot of the most logical, albeit speculative answers don't seem to be very good, which is why in some ways I preferred the original lore, dry as it was, that they were just serving the Catan, because at least that was neatly tied up. In many ways, they're kind of damned if they do and don't, because if they remain as they are, then they're consigned to this cold, sterile existence where only the few have retained anything of what they were, and what kind of existence is that going to be for the whole of time? You can well imagine questioning even what the purpose of existence would be at that point in time. If they went through the process though of reversing the biotransference in whatever form that would take, they're once again consumed then by the ravages of mortals, disease, entropy, war, the acceptance of their own mortality. Still, the diversity of the Necron dynasties does keep them interesting, and for the current time the Necron are far more concerned, rightly so, with reviving their power, closing the rift, dealing with chaos and the Eldari, and the other problems including the Tyranids, and of course the pesky Imperium. There also remains some genuinely interesting aspects to the Necron, one of the main ones being, despite their nihilistic hatred for all, they also appear to have this curious willingness to ally with others, even seemingly the Eldar at one point in the past. And that again raises a lot of possibilities going into the contemporary narrative of 40k. Now, I hope you can all appreciate that as someone who is literally immersed up to my eyeballs in 40k lore, I'm fully aware at the almost extraordinarily glacial pace of the narrative. I've even made my peace with the fact that I may not, in my lifetime, actually find out if the Emperor is ever resurrected or not. I genuinely think that could happen. Or, does he just remain on the Golden Throne forever? I might never know. I hope you've made your peace with that as well, because I genuinely don't see it coming anytime soon. I find that concept quite hilarious as well. At the same time, with a lot of this stuff, and with the Necron, they've had over 20 years for the Necron, 20 years, to give us a small, adjacent side story that just expands upon this speculative process of reversing biotransference. Illuminor Xerath. was the perfect vehicle for this. His entire purpose is to research and unlock the secrets of life. He's even stationed on the world where the Necron there, whose entire thing is trying to enable and understand this reverse transference. And he himself was involved in it in the first place. And I thought that this would be the starting point to begin revealing it to us finally. Finally, we would get at least some small hint towards what the Necron are actually attempting to do in the galaxy beyond just building up their old empires. And then what? This is the primary reason that I hate this detail within the Necron lore though, because I see it as being fundamental to completing their story and the logical position of their existence in the galaxy, and yet it never gets expanded upon. It's always just at the end of a sentence. I do find it extraordinarily frustrating, because it really would complete the picture for me, and then I would genuinely feel some small peace when it comes to the Necron. Anyway, that's my lore rant for today. I wish there was more for you, but it's really as simple as that. The two options for the Necron are both bad, and I just want something that points to which way the cards are going to fall. If you asked me though, while reverse biotransference is an interesting idea to achieve, I think ultimately it doesn't make sense, because I don't see the Necron civilization being able to exist in that form. They would have to relearn the entire nature of organic mortal forms. I'm not even sure if their technology, as I said, could even be operated, maintained, and used without their mastery of immortality and living metal and the Catan energies. Plus, the more I thought about it, wouldn't it be the most 40k of things for the ancient Necron tier to have started the war in heaven because they were so desperate for immortality, when they had the technology to just move elsewhere in the galaxy, away from the star that was constantly destroying them? That feels like it would have been the way to go. In their desperation though, they doomed themselves to this life of immortality and ended up with 90% of their population becoming zombies with no ability for sentient thought. And when all is said and done, when the ravages of time have consumed all, and the Necron are then left in a dead galaxy with no one to fight, no mortal races to dominate, and not even the ability to enjoy or develop further their own culture, that seems quite the 40k ending for the Necron, to me. And bizarrely at the end, I feel like I've almost fixed the whole problem there, because I think for the Necron, that seems quite the perfect 40k ending. That they're stranded in a dead galaxy with basically nothing to do for all eternity.